My name is Ilara. It's a name that means light, a detail my mother always loved to share, as if she had somehow predestined a life of sun-drenched ease for me. For most of my 34 years, I've tried to live up to it, seeking harmony over discord, yielding where I might have stood firm, all in the pursuit of a quiet, gentle existence. I am a landscape designer in Port Blossom, a city that clings to the coast like a barnacle to a ship's hull, where the air tastes of salt and the fog rolls in to soften the world's hard edges. My work is my solace. I find a deep, abiding peace in the logic of root systems, the patience of a perennial, the slow, deliberate art of coaxing life from the earth. It is a language I understand. For the past 8 years, my life had been intertwined with Julian's. He was a man of sharp angles and even sharper ambitions, a financial consultant who moved through the world with an unnerving, magnetic confidence. I was drawn to that certainty, mistaking his arrogance for strength. We built a life, or so I thought, in a beautiful apartment we called the Perch. It was on the top floor of a restored heritage building, with wide, old windows that overlooked the harbor, where the fishing boats looked like scattered toys in the morning light. I had filled its rooms with plants, with soft textures and colors borrowed from the sea and sky. It was more than a home, it was my sanctuary, the one place where the world felt entirely right. The conference room in the city of Silverwood was humming with the low, earnest buzz of professional passion. I was attending a national symposium on sustainable urban horticulture, a topic that made my heart beat a little faster. I had just finished a panel on native pollinator gardens when my phone vibrated on the polished oak table. Julian's name glowed on the screen. I smiled, stepping out into the hushed, carpeted hallway, expecting the familiar cadence of his check-in. How was the talk? Are you winning them over with your flower power? When are you coming home? Instead, his voice was a shard of ice in my ear, devoid of any warmth. Ilara, he began, the name a cold, flat stone. I'm divorcing you. The hallway seemed to tilt. I leaned against the wall, the flock wallpaper rough against my cheek. I heard the distant murmur of the conference, but it sounded like it was coming from underwater. What? I managed, my own voice a stranger's. I've filed the papers, he continued, a note of smug finality in his tone. It was the voice he used when he closed a particularly lucrative deal. And I've sold the Perch. Sophie and I need to liquidate our assets to get started on our new life. You'll need to figure out your living situation when you get back. Enjoy the rest of your trip. The line went dead. For a long moment, I didn't move. I couldn't breathe. The audacity of it was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. He had delivered this life-shattering news with the same emotional investment he'd used to cancel a dinner reservation. Sold the Perch. The words echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of my mind. My sanctuary. Our home. Sophie. The name hung in the air, a poisonous bloom. I wasn't entirely surprised. The late nights Julian had claimed were for work, the scent of a perfume that wasn't mine clinging faintly to his shirts, the growing emotional chasm between us, they were all signposts I had chosen to ignore. I had told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my insecurities get the better of me. But hearing him say her name so casually, as if I were a mere administrative detail in the grand project of their happiness, ignited a slow, deep burn in my chest. My hand tightened around the phone, my knuckles white. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Something inside me, a core of stillness I didn't know I possessed, held firm. He had said it with triumph, expecting me to crumble, to plead, to dissolve into hysterics. And in that moment, I resolved that I would not give him the satisfaction. My name is Ilara, and up until that phone call, I had believed that love meant accommodating, bending, and making oneself smaller to keep the peace. I had spent years deferring to Julian's judgment, especially when it came to our finances. He handled the investments, the bills, the serious decisions, often patting my head and calling my detailed budgets for my business cute. I had allowed him to frame my deep passion for my work as a quaint hobby, while his career was the real, solid engine of our lives. Looking back, the signs weren't just cracks in the foundation, they were seismic fissures I had papered over with hope and denial. His casual dismissal when I asked to see the joint bank statements. The way he'd wave his hand and say, "Don't worry your pretty head about it, I've got it handled." I had mistaken his secrecy for capability. Now, standing in that sterile hotel corridor, I saw it for what it was, a calculated campaign of control. The rest of the day is a blur. I remember walking back into the conference room, sitting down, and listening to a presentation on drought-resistant grasses. I nodded, I took notes, my hand moving on autopilot while my mind raced. Julian thought he had one. He thought he could detonate my life with a 90-second phone call, sell the home I had poured my heart and soul into, and walk away into the sunset with his new life, leaving me homeless and broken. But there was one crucial, beautiful detail he had overlooked. One small act of self-preservation I had taken months ago, a decision born not of suspicion, but of a quiet, nagging intuition. When we had refinanced the perch 8 months prior to get a better interest rate, our mortgage broker had presented us with several options. Julian, impatient and eager to get to a golf game, had barely skimmed the documents. "Whatever gets us the lowest rate, Ilara. You handle the details," he'd said, already halfway out the door. And so I had. I had read every line. And with the broker's guidance, I'd made a simple, legal choice. To simplify the paperwork and because my credit score was marginally better, we had agreed to transfer the deed into my name alone. Julian had signed the papers without a second thought, his flourishing, arrogant signature a testament to his own carelessness. He never asked for a copy. He never followed up. His inattention, the very thing that had so often made me feel insignificant, was about to become his undoing. By the time I returned to my hotel room that evening, the shock had finally receded, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. The grief for my marriage was a deep, aching wound, but it would have to wait. Julian wanted a battle? Fine. But he had unknowingly armed me with the only weapon that mattered. My first call was not to my mother, who would have dissolved into tears, or to my father, who would have wanted to fly out and confront Julian himself. It was to Maya. Maya, my oldest friend, my port in every storm, and, by a stroke of profound luck, a brilliant property lawyer. I laid out the story for her, my voice surprisingly steady, each word a carefully placed stone building a bridge back to myself. "He sold the perch," she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief and then a simmering anger on my behalf. "Without you? Does he have any idea that he legally can't do that?" "Apparently not," I said, and for the first time that day, a real, unforced smile touched my lips. "He seems to believe he's already spending the down payment on a new sofa for him and Sophie." Maya let out a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, this is going to be good. He's in for the rudest awakening of his life. Ilara, the sale is completely invalid. You have the deed, you have sole ownership. If he's accepted any money from a buyer, he has committed fraud. Serious, indictable fraud." The word fraud was like a jolt of electricity. It wasn't about revenge. It was about consequence. It was about the world finally snapping back into its correct alignment, where actions have repercussions. "What do we do, Maya?" "First thing tomorrow, I'll contact the listing agent and the buyer's attorney. I will inform them that the property was listed and sold illegally by a party with no ownership rights," she said, her voice all business now. "Then, we draft a formal letter to Julian, outlining the legal reality of his situation. If he so much as breathes in the wrong direction, we take him to the cleaners." Hanging up the phone, I felt a profound sense of calm settle over me. The storm inside had passed, leaving a quiet, determined stillness. Julian thought he had outsmarted me, that he had left me adrift and powerless. But in his haste and his hubris, he had handed me back the keys to my own life. The rest of the symposium passed in a productive haze. I networked, I learned, I immersed myself in the world of plants, a world of resilience, patience, and silent, powerful growth. The betrayal still hurt, a dull throb beneath my ribs, but the prospect of reclaiming what was mine gave me a focus I hadn't felt in years. When I boarded the plane back to Port Blossom 2 days later, I was not the same woman who had arrived. I was ready. Ready to face Julian, ready to dismantle his web of lies, and ready to start planting a new garden, one that was entirely my own. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about taking back my light. The flight home was a cocoon of time suspended between two worlds. Below me, a blanket of white clouds obscured the earth, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt a sense of clarity. Julian's arrogance wasn't just a character flaw, it was his operating system. He hadn't tried to be subtle about his betrayal because, in his mind, I wasn't a person with agency. I was a feature of his life that he had decided to uninstall. Instead of letting the familiar tide of anger rise, I focused on the quiet strength I felt gathering within me. He thought I was a delicate vine, easily uprooted. He was about to find out I had roots of stone. As the plane descended into Port Blossom, the familiar coastline coming into view, my first call was to Maya. "I've landed," I said, the words feeling heavy with significance as I navigated the bustling terminal. "What's our status?" "Welcome home," she replied, her voice crisp and reassuring. "I've spoken with the buyer's legal counsel." To say they were stunned is an understatement. They are furious with Julian and have already initiated proceedings to claw back their deposit. They are more than willing to provide statements, which strengthens our position immensely. "And Julian?" I asked, my heart giving a nervous flutter. "I sent the formal letter to his work and personal email addresses this morning," she said. "It lays out, in no uncertain terms, the invalidity of the sale, your sole and legal ownership of the property, and the very real criminal and civil penalties for fraud." He hasn't responded yet. My guess is he's either in a state of shock or furiously trying to figure a way to spin this. Let him spin, I thought, a grim satisfaction settling in. Let him see what it feels like when the world doesn't bend to his will. The taxi ride to the perch was surreal. I watched the familiar streets of Port Blossom slip by, the charming storefronts and windswept trees, and felt like a visitor in my own life. When I finally stood before my own front door, I took a deep breath, my new key feeling solid and real in my hand. Inside, the apartment was eerily quiet. Julian's presence was everywhere and nowhere. His expensive leather briefcase was on the floor by the door, his favorite cashmere throw was messily draped over the arm of the sofa. The space felt contaminated, the peace I had so carefully cultivated now soured by deceit. I set my suitcase down, a silent declaration that I was home, and I was not leaving. He came home hours later. I heard his key scratch at the lock, a sound that now set my teeth on edge. He strode in, his face a thunderous mask of rage, his phone clutched in his hand like a weapon. "What the hell is this, Elara?" he bellowed, shoving the phone in my direction. Maya's letter was open on the screen. "You're trying to sabotage me? You think you can stop me from selling my own apartment?" I remained seated at the small dining table, a cup of chamomile tea cradled in my hands. I looked up at him, my expression calm. "No, Julian," I said, my voice even. "It's not your apartment. It hasn't been for 8 months. You can't sell something you don't own." He froze, his fury momentarily eclipsed by confusion. "What are you talking about?" "My name is on the mortgage." "The mortgage, yes," I agreed. "But not the deed. Which is the only thing that matters when it comes to ownership." I had gone to the bank and retrieved a certified copy that morning. I slid the crisp document across the table toward him. "Remember when we refinanced? You were in such a hurry to get to your golf game. You told me to handle the details. So I did. You signed this, Julian. You signed away your ownership rights." He stared at the paper, his face slack with disbelief. For a moment, a flicker of fear crossed his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by his old, familiar sneer. "You think you're so clever. This is just a piece of paper. I made a deal. You're going to make us both look like fools." I met his gaze, unblinking. The deal is already dead, Julian. The buyers know the truth. They're demanding their deposit back, and they're not happy. Oh, and speaking of the deposit, I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice. I hope for your sake you haven't spent any of it. Because that would move this from a messy civil matter into something far more serious. For the first time since I'd known him, Julian's brash confidence wavered. He looked away, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. You don't know what you're doing, he muttered, the words lacking their usual conviction. Oh, I think I do, I said softly. For years, I let you convince me that I was naive, that I didn't understand the real world. But I was always paying attention, Julian. And now, you're the one who has to face the consequences. He began to pace the length of the living room, a caged animal. This is insane. You're overreacting. You can't just throw me out of here. I raised an eyebrow. Actually, I can. Legally, this is my home. You are here only because I am extending you the courtesy of a few days to get your affairs in order. But let me be perfectly clear. I am not going anywhere. The days that followed were a strange, tense ballet of avoidance and confrontation. Julian's rage slowly curdled into a kind of desperate pleading. He'd leave me voicemails that swung wildly between threats and apologies. We had 8 years, Ilara. Doesn't that mean anything, one would say, followed by another an hour later, you're trying to ruin me, and I won't let you. I didn't answer. I let Maya handle the communications. She was a firewall of calm, professional competence. You're in the driver's seat, Ilara, she told me over coffee at our favorite spot, the Seabreeze Cafe. He has no leverage. The potential fraud charge is a guillotine over his head. He'll have to agree to your terms in the divorce settlement if he knows what's good for him. Her words were a bomb, but they also highlighted how much I had ceded my own power in our marriage. I had carried the emotional weight, managed the household, and built a successful business from scratch, all while he reaped the benefits and took the credit. One evening, my friend Chloe came over, not as a lawyer, but as a friend. We began the process of disentangling his life from mine, starting with his closet. As we folded his expensive, soulless suits and packed them into boxes, a sense of liberation washed over me. How's he holding up under the pressure? Chloe asked, holding up a particularly garish tie with a grimace. Poorly, I said, a genuine laugh bubbling up. He's still operating under the assumption that if he talks long enough, I'll eventually just give in. It's how he's always operated. Good for you for not budging, she said, tossing the tie into a box marked donations. He doesn't deserve 1 more inch of your energy. I nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude for the strong, supportive women in my life. For so long, the marriage had been an island, isolating me. Now, I felt connected, held up by a network of care he could never touch. The final, inevitable confrontation came on a gray Saturday afternoon. I was at my drafting table, sketching a design for a public rooftop garden, when I heard the key in the lock. Julian walked in, and right behind him was Sophie. She was exactly as I'd pictured her, sleek, polished, and wearing an expression of faint boredom, as if she were touring a property slightly beneath her standards. She looked around the perch, her gaze sliding over my carefully tended orchids and the worn, comfortable armchair I loved, and a small, proprietary smile played on her lips. Her arm was looped through Julian's. So, this is it, she said, her voice a low purr of entitlement. It has potential. We'll need to get rid of all this clutter. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs, but my resolve was a cool, smooth stone in my gut. Hello, Julian, I said, my eyes flicking to the woman beside him. You must be Sophie. Her smile faltered. She looked at Julian, a question in her eyes. You said she'd be gone, she murmured. Ilara, Julian said, his voice tight. What is this? I thought we could be civil. Civil? I repeated, stepping away from the drafting table. I gestured around the light-filled room. Civil is not bringing your mistress to the home you share with your wife. And to be clear, this is my home. Not yours. Not hers. And it is certainly not a crash pad for you to begin your new life after you tried to sell it out from under me. Sophie's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up. She turned to Julian, her grip on his arm tightening. Wait, what is she talking about? Julian, you told me the sale went through. You said the money was already in escrow. Julian flinched as if struck. It's a complication, Sophie. A minor legal hiccup. I'm handling it. Oh, it's not a hiccup, I said, my voice clear and steady. I decided to speak directly to her, woman to woman. He tried to sell a property he doesn't own. The deed to this apartment has been exclusively in my name for months. The sale he negotiated is void. He lied to the buyers, and it seems, I paused, letting my gaze settle on her, he lied to you, too. Sophie's face, which had been a mask of cool indifference, began to crumble. He lied, she whispered, taking an involuntary step away from him. The money, for our investment, you said you had it. The realization dawned on her face, a slow-motion wave of horror and humiliation. Oh my God. You don't have it, do you? You have nothing. Sophie, listen to me, Julian pleaded, reaching for her hand. No, I said, cutting him off. Let me be clear. Not only did he fail to sell my home, but by accepting a deposit under false pretenses, he committed fraud. I have been advised to press criminal charges. The word criminal hung in the air between them. Sophie looked as if she might be sick. Fraud, she choked out, her eyes wide with panic. Are you serious? I am, I affirmed. And my patience is wearing thin. I want him and his belongings out of my home by the end of the day. Julian's entire posture seemed to deflate. The anger, the arrogance, the charm, it all evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, cornered man. Ilara, please, he said, his voice cracking. We had 8 years. You can't just do this to me. You did this to yourself, Julian, I said, my voice softening with a sudden, weary sadness. You were the one who ended our marriage over the phone. You were the one who laughed at the thought of me being homeless. You didn't just betray me, you tried to erase me. So do not stand in my living room and pretend to be the victim. Sophie took another step back, her face a pale mask. This is insane, she muttered, fumbling for the strap of her expensive handbag. You told me she was the unstable one. You said this would be clean. She shot him a look of pure venom. I'm not getting dragged down with you, Julian. Without another glance at him, she turned on her heel and fled, the slam of the apartment door echoing her departure. Julian stood frozen in the middle of the room, utterly defeated. I watched him for a moment, a strange mix of pity and relief swirling within me. Looks like you're on your own, I said quietly. Now, we need to talk about what happens next. He sank onto the sofa, the one he had planned to replace, and buried his face in his hands. Ilara, I'm sorry. I messed up. I know that. You don't have to ruin me completely. You're right, I said, walking to the bookshelf where I'd placed a thick manila envelope. I set it down on the coffee table in front of him. I don't. This is the divorce settlement Maya drafted. It's more than fair, it doesn't require you to compensate me for the emotional distress or the attempted fraud. It's a clean break. Sign it, and we can both move on. He stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed. You really hate me this much? A bitter laugh escaped me. Hate you? No, Julian. I don't have the energy to hate you. I just feel sorry for you. You had a life here. You had someone who, despite everything, genuinely cared for you. And you burned it all to the ground for a fantasy, because your ego couldn't stand not being the center of the universe. I stood, feeling a strange lightness in my limbs. I want you out by tonight. The boxes with your things are by the door. Whatever is left here at midnight, I'm disposing of. He opened his mouth, a final protest forming, but then he seemed to see the unshakable resolve in my eyes. He closed it, his shoulders slumping. Fine, he whispered. I'll go. Good, I said, walking to the door and holding it open for him. It was a final, quiet assertion of my ownership. He walked past me without making eye contact, his footsteps heavy with the weight of his own choices. For a fleeting second, I felt a pang of grief for the young couple we once were, the one who had first walked into this apartment full of dreams. But the feeling passed, replaced by the clean, sharp air of freedom. I closed the door behind him and turned the deadbolt. The solid, satisfying click was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. This was my home. My sanctuary. My light. And I was finally home. The silence that descended upon the perch after Julian left was not empty, it was resonant. It was a quiet filled with possibility, a blank canvas where a cacophony of lies and tension had once been. For the first time in years, I could hear my own thoughts without the static of his judgment. I walked through the rooms, touching the leaves of my plants, running my hand along the cool glass of the windows overlooking the harbor. It was as if the apartment itself took a deep, cleansing breath along with me. The spaces he had dominated felt vast and new. The corner of the living room where his monstrous leather recliner had sat was now an open invitation for a reading nook. The wall that had been covered in generic, soulless prints he'd bought from a catalog was now bare, waiting for art that meant something to me. The home was no longer a compromise. It was a promise. Maya came by that evening, bearing not wine for celebration, but 2 large pots of fragrant lavender. For peace and new beginnings, she said, her smile warm and genuine as she set them on the balcony. He's really gone, I said, the reality of it still sinking in. He just packed and left. Of course he did, Maya said, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. Bullies and narcissists only have power when you let them. The second you stood up to him with undeniable facts, his whole world fell apart. He didn't have a script for that. We sat on the balcony as twilight painted the sky in shades of dusky rose and violet, the scent of lavender and salt air mingling around us. We didn't talk much about Julian. Instead, we talked about the future. About a trip I'd always wanted to take to see the gardens of Kyoto. About a new, ambitious project Maya was taking on at her firm. It felt like my life was my own again, a story I was finally writing for myself. Over the next few weeks, I began the gentle, joyful work of reclaiming my space. I boxed up the last vestiges of Julian, the expensive espresso machine he used once, the set of crystal whiskey glasses he'd prized, and donated them. I hired painters and had the walls painted a soft, airy shade of sea glass green. I spent a whole Saturday at a local artisan market and bought a beautiful, hand-thrown ceramic lamp and a sprawling abstract painting of the coastline by a local artist. Each choice was an affirmation, this is me. This is what I love. The divorce proceeded with an almost anticlimactic smoothness. Julian, humbled and likely terrified of any further legal trouble, signed the papers without contest. The official notification arrived in my inbox on a Tuesday morning. I read the subject line, Decree of Dissolution, and felt not a dramatic surge of elation, but a quiet, profound sense of release. It was the gentle untying of a knot I had been carrying for years. One afternoon, while clearing out a storage closet, I found a small, forgotten box of photographs. Inside was a picture of Julian and me, taken on our honeymoon. We were on a beach, tanned and laughing, his arm wrapped tightly around me. We looked impossibly young, incandescent with a hope that now felt like it belonged to 2 different people. I looked at the smiling girl in the photo, the Alara who believed love was about self-sacrifice, and I felt a wave of compassion for her. She had done her best with the light she had. I didn't tear the photo up. Tearing it up would give it a power it no longer deserved. Instead, I slipped it back into the box and placed the box on a high shelf in the closet. It was part of my history, a chapter in my story, but it was not the whole book. life began to settle into a new, richer rhythm. My landscape design business flourished, as if the energy I was no longer pouring into a failing marriage was now free to nourish my work. I took on a project designing a therapeutic garden for a local hospice, pouring all my understanding of peace and healing into the winding paths and sensory flower beds. It felt meaningful in a way Julian's pursuit of wealth never had. Months later, I was having dinner with my parents. My father, a man of few words but deep feelings, raised his glass. "To Alara," he said, his eyes meeting mine across the table. "I've never seen you look so solid. Like you're finally standing in your own light." My mother squeezed my hand, her eyes glistening. "He was right about one thing," she whispered. "You are light." Tears pricked my own eyes, but they were tears of gratitude, not sorrow. They were right. The gentle, yielding nature I had once thought was a weakness was, in fact, the source of my resilience. I hadn't needed to become hard or vengeful to win. I had simply needed to become myself. That evening, I returned to the perch. The city lights of Port Blossom glittered across the dark water of the harbor. My home was quiet, filled with the scent of night-blooming jasmine from the balcony and the soft glow of the ceramic lamp. I curled up in my worn armchair, the one Sophie had called clutter, with a cup of tea and a book. The wound of Julian's betrayal had healed into a faint scar, a reminder not of the pain, but of my capacity to recover. His phone call had been meant to be an ending, a final, crushing assertion of his power. But he had failed to understand the nature of things that grow. Sometimes, the most devastating fire is what clears the way for new life. He hadn't destroyed my garden, he had, in his own cruel and unwitting way, given me the chance to replant it, stronger and more beautiful than before. And in the peaceful, quiet solitude of my own sanctuary, under the soft glow of my own light, I was finally, truly, beginning to blossom. Life settled into a rhythm that was all my own. The seasons turned, and Port Blossom cycled through its moods, the crisp, bright days of autumn when the sea was a deep sapphire, the quiet, contemplative gray of winter when fog softened the world into a watercolor painting, and then, the glorious, tentative return of spring. With each passing month, the ghost of Julian faded further, not into nothingness, but into a distant, settled part of my past, like a pressed flower in an old book. The perch became more than my home, it became an extension of my soul. I filled it with life, not just the sprawling monsteras and delicate ferns, but with the laughter of friends, the scent of baking bread on a Sunday morning, and the quiet hum of my own contentment. I learned the simple, profound joy of pleasing no one but myself. I could eat toast for dinner, leave a half-finished book open on the sofa for a week, and play the same sad, beautiful cello piece on repeat for an entire afternoon without a single dismissive comment. This quiet, unassuming freedom was the most precious thing I owned. My work on the Ocean View Hospice Garden consumed me in the best possible way. It was more than a commission, it was a calling. I spent hours on site, my hands in the rich, dark earth, my mind focused on creating a space that could offer a moment of peace at the end of a life. I designed winding, wheelchair-accessible paths, planted fragrant herbs like rosemary for remembrance and chamomile for calm, and installed a small, burbling water feature whose gentle sound could soothe a troubled mind. I spoke with the nurses, the staff, and sometimes, the patients themselves, listening to their stories and weaving their desires into the design. This garden was not for show, it was for service. It was the most important work I had ever done. It was on a soft, misty Tuesday in late April that I met Liam. I was kneeling by a newly planted bed of forget-me-nots, gently tamping the soil around their roots, when I heard the soft notes of a guitar. The music was simple, melodic, and achingly beautiful, weaving through the damp air like a silver thread. I looked up to see a man sitting on one of the new stone benches I'd had installed. He was focused on his instrument, his head bent, a cascade of dark, unruly curls falling over his forehead. He wasn't playing for an audience, he was simply playing. He must have sensed me watching, because he looked up. His eyes were a startlingly clear shade of green, the color of sea glass, and they held a deep, weary kindness. He gave me a small, almost shy smile. I hope I'm not disturbing your work, he said, his voice as warm and gentle as his music. Not at all, I replied, getting to my feet and wiping my earthy hands on my jeans. It's a welcome soundtrack. I should say the same to you, he gestured to the garden around us. This place, it's changing every day. It feels more peaceful here than anywhere else in the building. That's your doing, isn't it? You're Alara. I was taken aback that he knew my name. I am. And you are? Liam. I volunteer here. Play a bit of music for the residents, or anyone who wants to listen. He patted the spot on the bench next to him. My mother was here last year. This garden, she would have loved it. She would have loved you for making it. There was no artifice in his words, just a simple, profound gratitude that touched me deeply. I sat down, leaving a respectable distance between us. We fell into an easy conversation, talking about the garden, about the power of music, about the strange and beautiful ways people find comfort in difficult times. He spoke of his mother with a love that was both raw and gentle. I found myself telling him about my philosophy of landscape design, how I believed that a garden should be a dialogue between a person and nature, a place to feel connected, not just to look at. He listened with an attentiveness that was wholly unfamiliar to me. It wasn't the polite, waiting for his turn to speak listening I had known with Julian. It was an active, engaged presence. He watched my face as I spoke, his sea-glass eyes reflecting a genuine curiosity. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. A dialogue, he repeated softly. I like that. It's the same with music. You're not just playing notes, you're trying to have a conversation with a part of someone that doesn't use words. Our paths began to cross regularly after that. I'd be weeding a flower bed, and he'd be arriving with his guitar. We'd share a thermos of tea on a chilly morning or find shelter from a sudden spring shower under the new wooden pergola. Our conversations were never forced. They unfolded naturally, like the ferns I'd planted in the shady corners of the garden. I learned that he was a musician by trade, playing in a small, soulful folk band that had a loyal following in the city. He'd started volunteering after his mother's passing, wanting to give back the peace he'd found here. He never asked about my personal life. He didn't pry or push. He simply accepted me as I was, a woman in muddy boots with a passion for plants. And for my part, I found myself looking forward to the sound of his guitar, to the quiet companionship of his presence. It was a friendship that grew as organically as the garden around us, rooted in a shared space of healing and reflection. One afternoon, as the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the clouds in hues of apricot and gold, he lingered after I had packed up my tools. My band is playing a small show at the Lantern this Friday, he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It's a quiet place. Good acoustics. I was wondering, if you're not busy, if you'd like to come. My heart gave a sudden, sharp jolt. It was not an unpleasant feeling, but it was a startling one, like a dormant nerve coming back to life. A date. It felt like a date. The word itself sent a ripple of panic through me. My life was so carefully, peacefully curated now. My sanctuary, the perch, was a fortress of solitude. Letting someone in, not just into my life, but into my evening, into a public space as a we, felt like a monumental risk. The ghosts of the past rose up, unbidden. I saw Julian, preening at a corporate event, his hand on the small of my back, guiding me through a crowd as if I were an accessory. I remembered the feeling of being on display, of my worth being measured by how well I reflected his success. Oh, I said, my voice sounding thin. That's very kind of you, Liam. I fumbled for an excuse. I have an early start on Saturday, a big planting delivery. It was a lie, and a flimsy one at that. A flicker of disappointment crossed his face, but he masked it quickly with another gentle smile. Of course. Another time, maybe. The garden needs you. He slung his guitar case over his shoulder. Have a good evening, Alara. As I watched him walk away, a wave of self-recrimination washed over me. I had run. I had let the shadow of Julian dictate my present. I drove home to my beautiful, safe apartment, and for the first time since the divorce, it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. The next 2 days were torture. I went about my routine, but the peace was gone, replaced by a churning unease. I was angry with myself. I had fought so hard to win back my home, my independence, my very self. But what was the point of winning that freedom if I was too afraid to use it? Building walls to keep out pain also kept out joy. I had created a life that was safe, but was it truly alive? On Friday evening, I stood in the middle of my living room, the silence pressing in on me. I thought of Liam on a stage, pouring his heart into his music. I thought of his kindness, his respect, his quiet strength. He was nothing like Julian. And I was no longer the woman who had been married to Julian. I was stronger, wiser. I had roots. A little wind wasn't going to knock me over. On impulse, I changed out of my comfortable sweats and into a simple black dress. I put on a touch of mascara. I looked at the woman in the mirror, her eyes were clear, her expression resolute. She was nervous, yes, but she was not afraid. The Lantern was a small, intimate venue, tucked away on a side street downtown. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and spilled beer, but it was warm and welcoming. I slipped in and found a seat at a small table in the back just as the band was starting their set. And then I saw him. On the small, brightly lit stage, Liam was transformed. He was no longer the quiet, shy volunteer from the hospice. He was a force of nature, his fingers dancing over the strings of his guitar, his voice filling the room with a raw, honest emotion that silenced the crowd. He sang songs of love and loss, of hope and wandering, and with every note, I felt a wall inside me begin to crumble. He hadn't seen me come in. Between songs, as the applause washed over him, his eyes scanned the dark room. For a brief moment, our gazes met. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated gladness. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, and then he turned back to his microphone. "This last one is a new one," he said, his voice soft but clear. "It's about finding unexpected beauty in a place of healing. It's called Ilara's Garden. And he began to play. It was an instrumental piece, a melody that ebbed and flowed like the tide. I could hear it all in the music, the winding paths, the gentle rustle of leaves, the quiet strength of things that grow in the face of hardship. It was the most beautiful tribute I had ever received. In that moment, sitting in a dark, crowded room, I felt more seen and understood than I had in 8 years of marriage. Tears streamed down my face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of release. The final ghost of my past had been gently, beautifully, sung out of existence. After the show, he found me at my table. He didn't ask why I had changed my mind. He didn't need to. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "For the music." "Thank you for coming," he said, his sea-glass eyes soft in the dim light. He walked me to my car, the night air cool on my flushed cheeks. The silence between us was comfortable, charged with unspoken understanding. When we reached my car, I turned to him. I was scared, I admitted, the words coming out more easily than I expected. "Coming here tonight." It felt significant. "Everything worthwhile is," he said simply. He didn't move closer, didn't try to touch me. He just stood there, giving me all the space in the world. "The hospice garden is almost finished," I said, changing the subject, but not really. "The grand opening is next month. But I go there sometimes, in the evening, when no one is around. It's quiet then." I took a breath, a leap of faith. "If you'd like, you could walk through it with me sometime. When it's finished." His smile reached his eyes. "I would like that very much, Ilara." A few weeks later, on a warm evening just before the official opening, we met at the garden. It was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The lavender was in full fragrant bloom, and the forget-me-nots formed a carpet of delicate blue. We walked the winding paths together, side by side, not speaking much. We stopped at the center of the garden, by the burbling fountain. The sound of the water was a gentle percussion to the evening's quiet. "You did it," Liam said, his voice full of quiet awe. "You made a place for peace." I looked at the garden, this beautiful, living thing I had coaxed from the earth. And then I looked at him, a kind, gentle man whose music had opened the final door to my own healing. I had not been looking for this. I had been content in my fortress of solitude. But standing here, in this space I had created, with this man who saw me so clearly, I realized that true peace wasn't about building walls. It was about having a garden so strong and well-tended that you could finally dare to leave the gate open. I reached out and, for the first time, took his hand. His fingers curled around mine, warm and sure. It wasn't a grand, cinematic moment. It was quiet, real, and full of a gentle, hopeful light. It was not an ending, but a new, uncertain, and beautiful beginning. And for the first time in a very long time, I was not afraid to see what would grow next.